let's do a round of introductions. Laya, do you want to start?
Sure. I'm Laya V. Smith. I am a writer. I do mystery and thriller and horror and some romance and fantasy. My book out right now is a noir thriller called The Lumber Mill.
And Courtney, would you like to go?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. My name is Courtney Alameda. I am a YA horror writer and a comic book author. I've done stuff like Shudder and Pitch Dark and Seven Deadly Shadows. And I'm really excited to be here. Hi.
Yes. Sarah, would you like to go?
Sure. So my name is Sarah Seeley. I'm a Paleolithic archaeologist, which means that I like to look at very early archaeology that has to do with human evolution and early anatomically modern human or Homo sapiens prehistory. And I write science fiction, fantasy, and horror, mostly short stories and novelettes. And I published a few stories that have deal with romance a little bit. They're also a little bit scary in other ways too. So this will be fun.
Yes. And Miranda, last but not least.
Hi, I'm Miranda Renae, and I write horror. I do have a little bit of fantasy and romance.
Nice. Well, it's great to have all of you here. I'm excited to hear all of your inputs. So let's start with the first question. How does romance and horror relate to each other?
Hey, Elizabeth, do you want to introduce yourself?
Oh, yeah. I'm Elizabeth Suggs. I am the moderator. I am the League of Utah Writers Romance chapter president, and I also write horror. So, yeah.
Sweet.
Cool. Sorry, what was your question again now?
Yeah. No, it's okay. So my question was, how does romance and horror relate to each other? Who would like to go first? Do you want me to call on you guys?
No.
Well, I'll start. So they both kind of have to do with primal things related to survival. So romance ultimately, leads to social bonding and reproduction sorts of things, and then horror has to do. It could have to do with violence, but it could also just have to do with the stress of trying to survive other things that are going on in your environment. So they both kind of have these primal roots in our psyche that are deep and really important.
I also think the panel's title is very interesting. It talks about romance and horror being two sides of a coin. And oftentimes in the horror market, we actually talk about humor and horror being two sides of the same coin as well. And so both humor and romance kind of function the same inside a horror plot. And that gives the reader or the audience a moment to breathe in between all the tension and the stress that so many horror and thriller plots present.
Mm-hmm.
I would also add that arguably romance and horror are the two genres, maybe throw humor in there as well, that their main goal is to evoke very strong emotions in you.
Mm-hmm.
So they can go through and use some similar devices to achieve that goal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I like that. Miranda, would you like to say anything?
Actually, I don't really have much more to add. I agree with everything everyone said.
Wonderful. So kind of going in that, Courtney, you had mentioned that humor and horror were kind of two sides of the same coin because it's like one is releasing tension. But, as it was also mentioned by Leah and Sarah, where it's just like this like stress. Do you and this is for everyone, but do you think that romance and horror, like that romance relieves that stress, or does it just add more stress because it's just like, are they going to get together and are they going to get killed? It's like that back and forth.
Just your typical boy meets girl story.
But can there be anything relieving it, or is it just constantly stressful?
I think that both of them have the potential for catharsis at the end. A lot of horror has to do with that cathartic sort of feeling, and romance can do that also because it takes you on this crazy roller coaster ride, and then at the end you just have this like release of pressure when everything works out and is okay. And that's what a lot of romance readers are looking for, is that it's gonna be all right sort of feeling, which you also can get through horror a lot of the times in a very different way. But I think that's something that they have in common.
I think it's a different kind of tension as well. At least it is for me as a reader and a writer. It presents a different sort of challenge emotionally than does the serial killer standing outside my window about ready to stab me, you know?
I think if you're looking at the two together, because you could look at them, just as separate genres, what's going on with romance, what's going on with horror. If you're trying to look at, fuse those two together, it kind of depends on what you're trying to do, because it could be that the horror element is interfering with the romance element, and it could be that they overcome that horror element and they get together, or it could be that horror element conquers in the end. So maybe one of them dies, maybe one of them turns into a monster and loses their human identity or their human sense of they go around killing people, or they turn into a zombie or something, and you might be faced with maybe this individual isn't there anymore, and whatever's left could go on to hurt other people. Do I need to stop now my former partner from hurting people by killing them or something like that? So you can have some interesting, really kind of devastating sorts of things as well going on with just kind of throwing you for a loop, because that romance is very much kind of like, something we want to achieve. We want to find someone and feel grounded and feel connected to other people, and then the horror can get in and just kind of really mess with that and kind of ask, what does that mean if we really do a shift here in terms of the identity of one or the other or both individuals, or something like that. So you can have horror threaten in that way, or you could have it be a little bit, again, a little less devastating, where it's more just kind of the two individuals are trying to survive, and they're just trying to get a chance to get together and get to a stable place, and they're just overcoming a separate monster that's outside of their relationship. There's different ways that you can look at it. Just kind of depending how you're going to fuse that horror. If you are looking at kind of doing horror and romance together in a story.
Right.
Well, the horror could also be the romance itself as well.
Right. And so you're saying like the couple itself is that terrifying, that scary thing? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, it could be the relationship, could be the actual element of the horror. You could, I can't think of one right now, but possibly just unhealthy relationship that started off looking otherwise could turn into something extremely horrific by the end.
Right.
I think
so. It starts off as romance, and then it's not really a romance anymore. It's like a manipulative relationship. Yeah.
Just basically Ted Bundy's life right there.
Oh boy.
I think that even a depiction of a very healthy relationship can have elements of horror in it. Because when you're falling in love, there can be this tremendous loss of control, which can be incredibly scary. And it can be such this overwhelming emotional experience that can end up being one of the most frightening things that ever happens to you. And people have very strong emotional reactions, wanting to run away from love or whatever their personal hangups might be, being terrified that this person is going to hurt you. So even in the healthiest, most lovely romantic relationship, you can still have those, heart beating faster, terrified sorts of moments, because you are making yourself vulnerable and giving away that little piece of yourself that allows another person to hurt you.
Yeah. That's a good point.
Mhm.
A lot of the same sorts of physical reactions to love as you might have to horror.
Absolutely.
Kind of going into that, how does horror and romance differ?
I mean, hopefully in most ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
We hope that there are actually
Really?
happily ever afters and that it's not just a farce and and everything's a lie, you know?
Yeah.
We're just all experiments on a planet run by sentient mice, you know.
That's a horror story, right?
Which is like humor and horror and other
So many
things going on
emotions.
with
I
the
need Redwall right
namesake
now.
for the convention. Yeah.
It is so cute. I'm just like, oh, I just want to stay in the Redwall world. That's really nice.
Okay, so what books have played with the line between the two successfully?
You know, I
Um,
this might be kind of an interesting choice, but I would actually like to talk a little bit about I Am Not a Serial Killer.
Oh,
Which
that's an
is- it's
interesting
kind of-
choice.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. It's like teenage crush kinds of things. So you have John Cleaver who he doesn't really experience empathy and he has a really morbid sense of humor as he's trying to cope with his lack of empathy and desire to hurt things to kind of feel powerful and try to figure out what he's doing with those kinds of feelings. And so he tries to kind of stay away from girls, and over the course of a couple of books there ends up being a couple of different girls in his life that he likes, and he's actually trying to get close to them. And then one of them ends up dying, and it's kind of weird because he's there, like his family owns the mortuary that prepares the bodies, so he like gets to help prepare bodies, so it's kind of weird. and then there's another girl who ends up getting like possessed by an alien, and then the alien gets killed, but not necessarily an alien, some kind of like supernatural entity that goes around possessing different people, and this messes up her mind, so she ends up becoming like multiple personalities, basically. So it's interesting because the books overall are, I think he's trying to explore some to an extent anyway, he's trying to explore some of the more kind of difficult kinds of mental illness, things that are often explored in other kinds of stories, but he's trying to humanize them just a little bit more, even though they're still kind of scary sorts of things and they're in a fictional context. But yeah, just kind of some interesting things there as he's trying to kind of wrestle with, I have some things about myself and the way my brain works that I really shouldn't get close to people, but it's really hard because there's a part of me that, genuinely cherishes a few people and I would like to get close to them. And so he has to kind of balance those things. So it's kind of an interesting little, kind of a side aspect of those stories, but an interesting element there.
I haven't read a lot of stories, novels, et cetera, that do this very successfully for me. This intersection of horror and romance. I'm not saying that they're not out there. I just haven't encountered them personally. But the one that immediately always jumps to mind is a YA novel called Anna Dressed in Blood, which is about a young man who, because of a couple of circumstances, ends up falling in love with a very violent ghost. And it is surprisingly horrific and terrifying, but at the same time, the romance is incredibly lovely. So if you have not read that one, I would highly recommend it because what she's managed to do, what the author's managed to do, and for some reason, her name is now slipping my mind. I think it's Blake. I think her last name is Blake, but don't quote me on that. Is quite striking because it manages to walk that line of horror and romance incredibly well.
It's a really good book.
Yeah. Yeah, and beautifully written too.
It is, yeah, and the audiobook production of it is really good.
Oh, I haven't listened to it. I should.
I would say a story like Jane Eyre does well.
That's
with
fair.
it.
Jane Eyre is great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
when you start that book and some of the things that are going on with it, you could easily see it becoming a haunted house story. So it has all that creepiness and uncertainty and things in the dark that you're looking for with horror. Even something like Beauty and the Beast is a mixture of horror and romance.
Yeah. And, if we're talking classics, I mean, you could almost talk about Du Maurier, quick, Rebecca. There it is. Rebecca, I wouldn't consider horror necessarily. It's more thriller, but it really does that well.
And the classic, the Dracula.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's a lot of really good examples of this that I can think of in more classical fiction, like the French novel Pamela deals with it. Or a slightly different example, the Dangerous Liaisons, the French novel. That like Cruel Intentions, the movie was based on, that has, in a very blatant way, deals with manipulation and horror and, these characters who are complete narcissists. And then when one of them starts to fall in love and you have that element of romance going on, it all just gets torn apart by these demons living inside these two very evil main characters' psyche. But the thing that the horror is reacting upon in that novel is romance on every level, and just turning the romance into, this nightmarish caricature of itself.
Yeah, I was going to say that classic horror kind of evolved alongside or out of the Gothic movement, which was it's sort of taking so it's taking medieval architectures is kind of the setting, so it's a little bit mysterious and kind of is a throwback to the past a little bit, because these sorts of books were being written in like the late 1700s, early 1800s. So medieval times was kind of interesting to use as a setting, and felt a little bit mysterious. And so you had kind of this sense of trying to get the sense of mystery and eeriness and maybe a little bit of creepiness and the macabre and things like that are, that sort of thing goes even further back into all kinds of different cultures, probably back to the beginning of mankind with storytelling. So you have classic horror kind of evolving out of this and wanting to include romantic elements, perhaps in a sense of relationships, but that are romantic, but just more like relationships in general, even, and just kind of a sense of how does this creepiness kind of throw off kind of normal human interactions and make those relationships kind of interesting. So kind of going into that classic horror segment, it's literally this fusion of if nothing else, relationships with a sense of dread.
Mexican Gothic does a good job of pointing those things out.
Thanks, guys. So Courtney, you had mentioned some stories that didn't do successfully. What stories just did not do a horror romance well?
Ooh, that's a good question.
I'm trying so hard not to comment on Stephanie Meyers, because I did that once on a panel and then I felt really bad. Because it's like, hard. She makes a lot of money and she's a nice person and I shouldn't pick on her.
And I mean, for like YA writers, like, she built the industry, period.
Yes.
Like,
yes.
Even if I don't
There's
agree with her books, like, I can't sit here and bash her because she built YA. Like, without Stephanie Meyer, there would not be this industry for the rest of us to work in. So, and I have a hard time calling out writers because there's a lot of reasons things may or may not work, or maybe they just didn't work for me as a reader. It wasn't necessarily that the writing itself was bad or that the book itself was bad. It just, didn't work for me.
Yeah. I mean, I think overall, some of the challenges you have that you could face, just the practicality, because a lot of story building is you're using mechanisms to try and make an emotional reaction. So you might end up putting two things together and you're trying to call it like a horror romance, and you end up making something that's just very offensive because you've got what you're really showing is an abusive relationship and you're trying to call it romantic or something like that. So you face some challenges with trying to fuse these two kinds of elements together and call it romance, when what it really is you're trying to talk about how elements related to sexual attraction or something like that, not necessarily romance. Or just sex in a relationship, and how something ends up there's other horror elements that are manipulative or something like that. So it's not really romantic, but it is about the complexities of sex in a political sense or something like that. So it's kind of interesting trying to use the word romance, I think, for some of these things where you are looking at things that in a healthy aspect would be romantic, would be romance, but when you're trying to fuse it with horror, it might not be romantic, but it's hard to find that category to stick it in to say we're not posting this as a healthy relationship, we're trying to make a commentary on unhealthy relationships or something like that. So I think that's one challenge that you can face in general with trying to fuse the two together, and maybe a mistake that people might make where you're trying to do something like that, and instead of just kind of calling it what it is, you might try to say this is romantic, even though it's kind of creepy and manipulative, and people are going to be like, no, it's not. So just kind of being aware that like when you're doing something that's not dealing with those primal emotions, it's not as big a deal if you're making a mistake with science fiction where you just have something that kind of doesn't make sense because it was too abstract or something like that. Whereas when you're dealing with the primal emotions, it's a little bit easier to put things together in a way that feels uncomfortable. And again, there's a space to have a conversation about that, but it's hard to get the right category for it.
Right.
Yeah, this really isn't a good answer to your question, but I think going back and reading older romance novels can be quite horrific.
Mm-hmm.
Because of exactly what you were talking about, where you have a lot of very unhealthy, abusive, stalker-ish, and sometimes incredibly rapey things going on. And it's all shown as romance. Like I for example, was recording this audiobook, and I did not read it all the way through before I agreed to do it. And as you're going through it, your main hero is he's so rapey.
Oh no.
He is just so rapey. And the main woman is written really well. Like, she's in depth, she's three-dimensional, and then as I'm reading the book, there's just this sense of dread growing in my heart as she slowly starts falling in love with this man.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes romance can very easily, in real life and in fiction, slip into the realm of horror.
Mm-hmm.
Without it even meaning to, which is another reason why I think these two things are so closely related, because it's something that happens all the time, unfortunately. That romance can become horrific when people somebody makes themselves vulnerable and the other person doesn't respect boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with that. I read a novel that was not a speculative fiction novel. It wasn't science fiction, horror, et cetera, but it was a literary novel about a young woman who is kidnapped and taken out to the Australian outback. And she ends up falling in love with him. And it was an incredibly romantic novel, quote unquote, but you as a reader realize that she is suffering from Stockholm syndrome. It was awful to read. And when she finally gets out, she has to reckon with the fact that she has these super strong feelings for a man who, even though he was kind to her, he took away all of her autonomy and her ability to make decisions for herself. And that was horrifying in an entirely different way.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Well, what novel was that?
That was called Stolen. It's a YA novel that came out, I want to say, early 2010s by Lucy Christopher. Won a couple of awards. That was a trip, to say the least. That was a rough read. So, yeah, but very strong, like romantic overtones and plotting. I mean, that's the way she wanted you to feel, like absolutely horrified that you were, at what you were watching on the page. Yeah, it was well done.
Yeah. So, okay, what if a writer wants to get involved, like they want to start writing a horror romance? What would you suggest? Like, how should they start?
Honestly, I am all ears for this one because I am writing my first really strong romantic plot in a straight up horror novel right now. So I would love to hear what the panel has to say about this. I will say that it's difficult.
For me, I think it's important to start with character and really get deep into your two characters and understand where they are compatible and where they clash against each other. Before you put them through any amount of plot whatsoever, just having that foundation of their psyches can be so helpful to see how they're going to fit together and what situations will bring them together, what situations will push them apart. And then once you know those two characters really well, you can put them through anything. You can put them through any horrific situation, and you will know whether it's going to be something that is good for the romance or is terrible for the romance.
I would add you want to know the tropes in both horror and romance before you start writing, so you know what trope you will or will not follow and what ones you want to break.
I just lost my train of thought. What I was going to say. I think, it depends on whether you want to actually do a healthy, functional, or could become a functional relationship that is actually romantic, or if what you want to look at is kind of a fatal attraction where it's dysfunctional. Some places you could look for inspiration for dysfunctional, just go watch some Dr. Phil or Judge Judy. I mean, I know that sounds terrible, but he talks to people who have a variety of interesting things going on with mental illness and things going on with relationships and in general things going on with their families. I don't want to bash on anyone who's been on Dr. Phil. I think that's a really terrifying place to go for some of those really deep conversations he has with some people. And some people might have different feelings about even watching Dr. Phil, and I respect that too. But if you don't want to watch Dr. Phil, you could go to Judge Judy and just watch people kind of fighting with each other over smaller kinds of things. Where I watched an episode of another guy called Judge Rinder, where a husband was trying to sue his wife because he tripped over the dishwasher lid was left down and he tripped over it. And anyway, just kind of funny. But so you could just kind of get some inspiration from places in the world where you feel comfortable getting some education about the kinds of challenges that people have in real life that can be really dysfunctional, but there's a lot of these. Actually, I feel like Dr. Phil tries to help people. I feel like he's genuinely trying to help people overall. Or you could watch Kitchen Nightmares or something like that with Chef Ramsay or something, where you've got people who just have some other kinds of challenges, but they're things that they could overcome, if they make certain choices. But yeah, I mean, you could also get some ideas from that in terms of, what could happen if they chose not to do something to get themselves help or something, because it can give you some ideas as well as to how deep some challenges that people get into that can really ruin their relationships too.
To kind of dovetail on that,
sure, yes,
I would highly recommend something like a subreddit like Am I the Asshole? Sorry, that's what it's called. I don't mean to swear, but Am I the Asshole? Or relationship advice on Reddit, because it's people going to the Reddit community and saying, this is my problem. This is what's going on. And I have found that to be a treasure trove of human insanity. Like, honestly, like I have learned that people are just nuts from Reddit. And granted, some of these are probably creative writing, exercises. I'm sure some of this is made up, but some of them aren't, and they are fascinating. Like, if you're into people watching or trying to at all make sense of motivations and what drives people, both of those subreddits are very interesting treasure troves of just humans being just human, honestly.
And then, just one more thing really fast. And then if you want to do functional relationships, one thing I would think about is thresholds, like moral thresholds. Like, just be aware that, there's some lines that people can cross that are a little bit dysfunctional that they can come back from more easily than other lines. So that would be my suggestion for something more functional. Okay.
It's going to be hard to come back from gaslighting in line.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just going to add, when it comes to like inspiration for this sort of thing, is that romance, most people have some experience with it, whether it's your own personal experience or you've had friends in your life and you've had opportunities to deal with all of these kinds of very intense emotions, and it can be really helpful for your writing to dig into those and your own experiences, and thinking about experiences of people who are close to you, and kind of take them and twist them around and think about how it made you feel and why, and then plug that into your writing. So taking it from your own life can lead to a lot of depth in your relationships.
And kind of exploring that with how would you suggest they start writing with horror? What if they've only written romance? How would you suggest they get horror in their story?
You always start with what scares you. It doesn't necessarily have to be a literal thing that scares you, but basically, as horror writers, we always say that we're the best adjusted of all of the different kinds of writers, that we are the friendliest writers because we spend our days exercising our demons on the page. So whatever frightens you is going to show up in your work. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's another, you have to get into your own brain and figure out what it is that creeps you out, because that's the thing you're going to be able to most effectively creep other people out with. So you have to be a little bit brave, I think, to write horror and do it well, because you really have to get into the things that frighten you.
And also, I will note that a lot of successful horror also features some sort of isolation, whether that's actual physical isolation, like, let's say, the crew in Alien, like, in the depths of space, or the kids in Cabin in the Woods, like, away from everyone, or social isolation, too. Psychological isolation, emotional isolation. There's a lot of different ways to isolate your characters. But in general, and this is a really broad generality here, we do tend to, shoot for the fringes in horror.
Yeah, isolation is another theme that relates back to romance really, really well.
Yeah.
Because, for obvious reasons, I think.
I am so suppressing about Chihuahua right now. I'm an adult.
What about tropes? So, Miranda, you had mentioned tropes, like picking the best tropes from horror and romance. What tropes do you think, and this again for everyone, work best when it's a horror romance story?
I think, truthfully, it depends on your story, but I think if you're going, you need to get ones that actually fit together. So you don't want to do, I cannot think of anything right now. My brain is fried. Sorry, but you don't want to choose one that's totally, completely opposite from the other, and they're not going to be able to mingle in the end.
I mean, I would say that it's a little bit of a continuum. So you could have a story that is a little bit more horror focused, and then the romance is kind of a side plot. Or you could slide the other way and have it be more of a romance or even a complicated relationship kind of a story that could go in a positive direction, but there's some horror moments in it that are a little bit shocking. I actually want to use a story that I wrote as an example. So I wrote a story. It's a retelling of Samson and Delilah, where Samson is a genie, and he's a little bit psycho. He he doesn't have the ability to feel empathy really well, and he has this problem where if he actually starts to become fond of humans or fall in love, he actually kind of gets stuck and can't shapeshift anymore. So he kind of loses his magic powers, and he's trying to. So he has people that he has compassion for, or that he's intrigued by, but he tries to kind of keep himself from actually fully falling in love. And so there's this moment where he's married Delilah, and in my story, Delilah's had kind of this interesting background where her ex-husband tried to basically had her kicked out of her father's house, and he divorced her and kind of set it up to make it look like she stole something. And anyway, so Samson decides he wants to get revenge for her, and brings her ex-husband and his new wife, and they're all tied up, and and they're terrified, and she's like, "What are you doing?" and he's like, "These people messed up your life, and I'm going to make it right." And she's like, "This is not how you make it right." And he ends up turning her ex-husband into a beetle, and she like goes around trying to chase him, and then eventually he flies away and gets eaten by a bird. So I have like this little horror moment that's in there where it's like, oh my gosh, I can't fix this. Like this shocking thing just happened. But then it goes back to kind of the complexities of her relationship with Samson in the story. So that would be my example and my own little plug here.
Courtney, Leah, do either of you have any thoughts?
I'm now trying to remember the exact nature of the question. I'm sorry.
Tropes. So what tropes? Yeah, would you suggest for horror romance?
Right. Oh, that's a good question.
Sorry, I guess I went off on a tangent a little bit. Dang it, I was trying to avoid that.
No, I'm like thinking about genies and biblical stories. And
I don't think that there are any in particular that would necessarily work better than others. If you have a list of horror tropes on one side and you have a list of romance tropes on the other side, and you were to just, throw a few darts at the board and pick a few, I think you could write an amazing story from pretty much any of them. Just understanding each of the tropes individually, and also understanding what your primary genre is and what are going to be your obligatory scenes in each one and what your main arc of it wants to be. As long as you have a good understanding of that, I think you could throw in a few of each, and have a mixed bag and come out with a good story.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know so much about tropes in particular. What I'm working on right now is a little transgressive in terms of the horror, because in the horror, our job is to make you uncomfortable, essentially. And so in the early drafts of the novel I'm working on right now, I have, and granted, this may not make it to the page. My editor might be like, yeah, no, we're not doing this in a YA book, but the novel is set in 1912, so we're talking about Belle Epic. And I have a younger woman who's about 17, 18, dating a mid-20s man. And I may or may not be able to do that in YA. I may or may not be allowed to do that, but I definitely want this relationship to feel creepy and not at all healthy. And the age gap is one thing that I think modern readers will really understand. Even though it's a historical novel, they'll see that age gap and go, oh, this is not okay. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I think you can play by the tropes too, and that's great. There's nothing wrong with that. But, feel free to experiment in that space too, and try things that may be difficult and may not work out in the end. Honestly, like I may not be allowed to do this in the end. I may not be able to pull it off, but it's worth a shot at trying, because I think the creep factor of the relationship will make the entire novel just that much scarier, essentially. I hope. Fingers crossed.
Right.
We'll see what happens.
I think tropes are it's important to understand them in whatever genre that you're writing in, but it's also important, once you understand them, to know that you can subvert them. Mm-hmm. You can play with those expectations, and that's something that horror, and especially like horror movies, really good ones, that they do that well. Because everybody, even if you don't know that you know horror movie tropes, mm-hmm. and when one of those gets subverted, that can be one of the most interesting things that can happen. So they're very useful. They should be in your toolbox, but don't be afraid to play. You should change them and play with them and subvert them and twist them around until they work for you.
Be adventurous. Try new things.
I like that. I like that a lot. Especially with horror romance. I feel like you have to be very courageous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Very different genres that have different expectations. So, yeah. Cool. So we're just a little past the 10-minute mark for Q&A. So why don't we get that started? Our producer is going to call out those questions.
All right, so first of all, we're going to go back a bit to one that Leah mentioned. So speaking of Pamela, which has been considered one of the first blockbuster stories and is a truly horrific story of workplace harassment, what do you think about mundane horror? And in return, what about a mundane romance as a way to escape severe horror in the same story?
I think mundane horror can be really effective. A lot of times more so than your over the top supernatural kind of horror, because it really relates to your audience. If you can bring out things that are horrific in just everyday situations. I read this really fascinating book called Horror in Architecture, where it goes through and talks about it just had a bunch of different pictures of buildings, and it did a really good job of explaining the different things that make us uncomfortable in our everyday life because they mess with our expectations. Like something that's supposed to be this size being the wrong size, or the electrical work or the piping being on the outside of a building instead of inside it. So things just being just a little bit wrong that makes you uncomfortable. And doing that in a particular way can be really effective in mundane horror to bring out those frightening aspects that everybody has to deal with in your normal everyday life. And then the other part of the question, like having a mundane romance, I think that kind of goes back to like what Courtney was saying about having breathing room in your horror. That could be used as that sort of a device where, everything is wrong. This is a weird example, but I don't know if anybody's ever seen the Maria Bamford show.
Yes.
Yes. So that show is so over the top, insane, crazy all of the time, except for when she's with her boyfriend. And then all of those, outlandish, I don't even know how to describe it.
It's outlandish is a great word for it.
Yeah. Those fade away.
Yeah,
those all fade away, and that show it deals with mental illness in a lot of ways. But it's funny and it's thought provoking. It's a good show. But when she's with her boyfriend, everything just calms down, and you have these simple, sweet, or slightly difficult or mundane but very realistic moments that kind of bring all of the craziness in the rest of the show and elevate it to another level where it's not just there for pure insanity. It actually helps you to think about it.
I kind of want to talk about that elevation and that heightening of either the fear or the love reactions. The forerunner of splatter porn was a little theater in France called the Grand Guignol. And I'm sorry, I don't speak French, so I'm probably slaughtering that. But what they would do is they'd have these horrific plays where people would get flayed, they'd get their throats slit, they'd get hands cut off. interspersed with these comedic farces that were usually like sex comedies or something like that. And the idea behind the theater essentially was that by doing these quote unquote hot cold showers where you'd have the fear next to the comedy or the romance, you would eventually have a much higher response from the audience than you would if you had just stuck to one lane. So I think that's why it's important if you can't get the comedy in, maybe to try a little romance in the book, because it does end up, whether you're getting the relief from that secondary plot or that secondary genre, or whether you're heightening that emotion with it, it really does add to your novel and or your story in general.
So is that kind of what that scene in the old Interview with the Vampire movie is based on?
It is,
Okay.
absolutely. That was a real theater that ran from like 1885 to the end of World War II. Mm-hmm.
I can't believe I've never heard of this before. That sounds...
Yeah, it's crazy. The French are so fun, let me tell you.
They're amazing.
Way more fun than the Brits. Sorry, British people. The French are just crazy in a good way.
All right, so next we have from Swaith, regarding mixing and matching tropes. Romancing the Beat has a lot of good romance beats and tropes, of course, but any suggestions for something similar other than TV tropes, which is exhaustive but not easily navigated, for specifically horror beats and tropes?
Let's see.
Good
There's
question.
a book that with Writer's Digest. Let me see if I can find it really quickly.
Headphones are coming off.
There's this book of essays on horror from the perspective of several different authors that might be useful if you're trying to get some ideas about just different authors' perspectives on horror and yeah. So let's see what authors does it have in here again. It has a whole bunch. Joyce Carol Oates, Michael McCartney, Robert Weinberg. I don't actually know a lot of these people. Michael A. Arnzen is in here. I think there's some stuff in here by oh my goodness, why can't I think of his name? Stephen King, I think has some essays in here as well, possibly. I don't know. There's a whole bunch of essays in here, but just different perspectives on horror from different authors. So that could be a resource.
Yeah, I love TV tropes. I can fall down that rabbit hole for hours.
The black hole of TV tropes.
Oh yeah, it's great. I think one way to get really intimate with horror tropes is by reading horror short fiction. Because a lot of times they'll deal with just one, and you can these stories that even flash fiction. There's a lot of horror flash fiction that's really good, or stories that are only 1,000 words long or something like that, and it'll be just this one trope really, and you just explore it throughout the whole story. So that can be a really good way to get very familiar with your horror tropes.
All right, so it looks like we only have the 1 minute left here. So I'm going to go ahead and ask you guys, please plug your works. Tell us what you've got going next, any panels remaining in these last few hours, and what you've got coming up next.
So last panel.
Yes,
panel.
last
Woo!
one.
Last panel.
All right. Well, if you want to learn more about the kinds of stuff I write, I'm an occasional blogger just because I'm also trying to do science things too as a professor and hopefully going into a PhD program next year. You can find me at slithersofthought.com. If you can't quite figure out what I'm saying over the microphone, you can also just look for my name, SarahESeeley.com. I'm also trying to start a YouTube channel, so if you're able to find Slither Scriptura, or go to my blog and you can find it from there, or go to my Facebook page. I'm also trying to give away some Kindle copies of some of my short stories. So there's a place on Facebook to comment. If you're able to find my very small YouTube page, go comment on there, and I'll give away some Kindle copies of my stories.
I'm just Laya V Smith all over the internet, LAYAV Smith. And my most recent book is The Lumber Mill, and it's available in all the best places. So go check that out.
Yep, same for me. I'm Courtney Alameda everywhere. On Twitter, you'll find me at Court Alameda. And also, I play D&D. I'm going to give a plug to Typecast RPG. I play D&D on Tuesday nights with like Dan Wells and Brian McClellan and Marty Murdoch and Ethan Sproat. We have a super fun time, so you can find us on Twitch.
You can find me at mirandarenae.com. My first novel, Wonderland, came out earlier this year, late last year, and
I'm going to check you all out now.
All right.
Bless your heart.